Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Underground. So today we have a sort of special seasonal episode for you, in which we're going to talk about some considerations for conducting religious activities or practicing your religion under a tyrannical or oppressive system. So right up front, I just want to say that this is the, I think, 8th time we're recording this, so forgive us if things don't quite match up, because this is a very, very hot topic, a very, very hot topic for a lot of people, especially as we move forward into the height of the holiday season for 2020. And we have to realize that the reason that we're talking about this is really twofold. And the first reason that we're talking about this is that a lot of the COVID lockdown procedures, or whatever we're calling those lockdowns now, be it, tyrannical, oppressive maneuvers or legitimate, medical things, whatever you want to call it, you have to realize that most of these COVID lockdown procedures are in direct conflict with the nature of religion. So the nature of the COVID lockdowns and the nature of religion itself, they're at odds with each other. So even if you didn't have a tyrannical system, that's a particularly tyrannical system that's trying to lock things down, medicine isn't always at odds with religion, right? But we have to realize that now a lot of tyrants are taking advantage of that. So the nature of these COVID lockdowns, and a sort of anti-societal lockdown procedure. And, over on this corner, you've got, your church or your religious activity, which is a very community-based, a very person-based, very person-to-person, very personal thing for a lot of people. When you sort of put those two in the same arena, there tends to be a lot of conflict there. And then also, like I mentioned, we have a so purely nefarious, like there's no ifs, ands, or buts. There's pure nefarious activity going on when it comes to religion in a lot of areas, particularly places like either Texas or New York, where politicians are ordering police officers to arrest people for conducting religious activities, because those religious activities either defy some kind of COVID thing or just because they don't like them. So, even though the stuff we're going to be talking about today is mostly worst case scenario, we also wanted to make this video survivable for the future. So even though as we move forward into the 2020 holiday season, the height of that, we also wanted to point out that this video is meant to last for multiple years. So even though we don't live entirely in a sort of Chinese communist lockdown on religion situation here in America in 2020, 2021 might be different. Thus the video, right? So we also wanted to point out that, like I mentioned, when people think of religious persecution, they tend to think of things like, the pilgrims coming over from Europe. Even though that's not necessarily a perfect story, that's what people tend to think of. They don't necessarily think of anything modern. And that's what we're coming at it from today. We're coming at it from the modern perspective. Chinese religious persecution of religious activities in Europe, things like that. And as a result, we wanted to once again point out that it's not our job to tell anyone what to do when it comes to their religion. It's not only is it none of our business, but no one should be doing that. And, like I mentioned, we have filmed this a lot of times. And the reason for that is it's very difficult to word things in such a way that isn't offensive or crass or something wrong with it. It just doesn't quite sound right. I can't tell you how many we've spent like 6 hours filming this so far, and it's every time I'll just say something that doesn't sound right, or it's just like, man, that did not come out right. So forgive us if that's what happens. We also wanted to point out that the writers that gave me the talking points for this episode today are not religious people. And we did that on purpose. We wanted people to write this from a non-religious perspective because of their ability to look from the outside in, right? So whether or not we have staff here that's extremely religious, some people, that are atheists or agnostic or whatever you want to call it. And so we had a think tank together, and we wanted to write this from the perspective of someone who is not involved in really any organized religion right now, but has knowledge of it, right? So if we don't get things necessarily quite right, please forgive us. We're not intending to be offensive or anything bad. We're just trying to come at this from an analytical standpoint. So that should, help out. I'm sure that the comment section will blow up, but we wanted to make it very, very clear, as with a lot of our stuff that tends to be inflammatory, we have to spend a few minutes at the beginning talking about why we're coming at this, and just to kind of make sure that everybody knows we're coming at this from a purely good and honest, perspective. So with that out of the way, let's jump right into the first category, and that is undercover agents. So one of the things that has happened for many, many years now is people, particularly law enforcement, but other groups as well, just the cases we have are law enforcement, groups or people infiltrating a religious activity in order to surveil it or conduct some kind of intelligence gathering. And the example we have here on the slide is a screenshot from a video that was taken, I can't remember, some time ago. It's not labeled here for me. Of 3 New York police officers. I don't know if they were sheriffs or if they were NYPD, but these 3 guys decided that it would be a good idea to conduct a surveillance operation following, I think it was the summer of 2020 actually, because they were conducting surveillance of protest activity in a predominantly Jewish community as a result of the George Floyd protests earlier this year. And they decided to go about doing that by dressing up in traditional Jewish clothing. They were wearing, I forget the names, but they were wearing traditional hats. They had traditional Jewish hairstyles. They looked, to an outsider who is not Jewish, they looked like, Jewish people of the Jewish faith, coming or going, from the synagogue or something like that. They blended in to the crowd. However, and this points to one of the first bullet points here, is that generally speaking, outside infiltrators are extremely easy to identify when it comes to surveillance. So when this video showed up on the internet, people in that Jewish community, and really every Jewish community that we saw, there were tens of thousands of comments just slamming these guys. They were wearing, the wrong sized hats. The reason they got noticed in the first place is that they were using cell phones on the Sabbath, which is not permitted in the Jewish faith. So they made a huge mistake there, and that got attention put on them. And then people started looking at, some of their other clothing and some of the ways they were acting, and it was just like they were sticking out like sore thumbs to people of the Jewish faith. So that's something that's kind of easy. One of the undercover agents sort of thing is easy to get out of the way right to start with. Now, it must also be noted that the nature of religion, most religions on earth, tends to be very altruistic in nature. Most religion teaches tenets of being good, helping your neighbor, things like that. So some people will want to be that good-natured person and let in someone to a religious activity that is obviously an infiltrator, right? So we have that going on, but we also have to realize that you don't want to be paranoid to the point to where your, congregation or parishioners or whoever start being paranoid towards one another, right? That's not something that we want. But we did want to point out that, law enforcement has routinely posed as religious personnel when it comes to surveillance. So that is definitely a thing to watch out for. So yeah, that's the news article that shows that they were caught using the cell phone on the Shabbat or the Sabbath. And then another thing to think about is the concept of informant neighbors. So a lot of people nowadays are being taught by their government or their politicians to call in or report religious activities, or really any gathering activities. They disguise it as gatherings. So for instance, the governor of Oregon, the governor of New York, a lot of these governors are setting up either hotlines so that people can snitch on each other or things like that. And thankfully, the internet has been quite hostile to this idea. But even though people have were quick to jump to some Karen, calls in a party or something like that, we have to realize that Today, it may be a joke. Today, it may not be a thing that we take seriously. But tomorrow, it could be a security threat. So your Karen neighbor, or for lack of a less offensive term to people who are actually named Karen out there, someone who is calling in these, reporting sitting at their window with their phone in their hand, calling the police to report their neighbor for walking their dog or something. People who do that, they could very well be a security threat tomorrow. So we also have to remember that, like I said on the previous slide, that most major religions teach this sort of love thy neighbor sentiment, right? But this feeling is most certainly more often than not mutual when it comes to these COVID things. So just remember that even though you want to be a kind person to someone else, they may not be a kind person to you. And when it comes to that, someone not being kind could result in your door getting kicked in. So we have to realize that this is, something apart from religion, that the social engineering that governments have done on people as part of this COVID thing, that social engineering has worked. It has been very effective because we have changed our culture in less than a year's time. And there haven't really been any congressional laws telling people to do it. It's all been either executive orders or just federal recommendations, right? So we have to remember that even though we may have the best intentions for people and that we may want people to be, safe and secure and things like that, others may not. So just keep that in mind. And then another thing that is very contentious now, and this slide is one of the main reasons why we've recorded this so many times, is because I haven't found a good way to say this. I'm just going to come out and say it, is that a lot of religious activities, particularly churches that have a hierarchical structure such as Catholicism, right, has different layers of authority within the church. A lot of these religious structures have been very tyrannical towards their own people of their own faith, right? So the leadership of many religious institutions are, quite frankly, willing collaborators of infringements on their own religion, right? I can't tell you how many articles I have read that state that, these COVID procedures are not persecution. They are not persecution. They're not infringing on your religious freedoms whatsoever. But that's not true. Like, this is just blanket propaganda that's put out by the church to infringe on itself, which none of us here quite understand, right? And we have to realize that since that's the case, this division, right? You have people that want to get together in a small group, or a group of like maybe 100 or so, like most churches in the United States, or synagogues or mosques, right? They want to get together in a group of maybe 100 or so or less. And some people will want to have an underground secret church that the government doesn't know about, and other people within that congregation won't, right? So this division within a religious institution almost always results in some kind of conflict breaking out. Now, the severity of that is, different. It varies, right, over time. But since, like I said, most religions have a very strong sense of community, and these internal problems could be very, very severe. So I guess to sort of sum up this sentiment, I would say that we must recognize that even now, even in late, mid-December 2020, which is when we're filming this, we have to recognize that some people will want to comply more or less than you. And that is something that we don't have a solution for. We have not figured out how to approach that other than just saying that is the case, right? We don't have a solution, but we know it's true that some people will want to comply more than you. Some people will want to comply less than you. Some people will want to comply with every single thing the government says. Some people will want to comply with none of what the government says. And there's very, very different reasons for doing so. So we must recognize that there's different thresholds, there's different lines in the sand. Some people don't even have a line, right? So when it comes to religion, which is, teaches morals and things like that, we have the potential for conflict there. And then next up is the concept of transportation. So if you wanted to have an underground church, a secret, house church or something like that, you have to realize that we got to look back at when this COVID stuff first happened, right? When these COVID lockdowns first happened. I have personally driven through many military checkpoints and many police checkpoints when it comes to the COVID stuff. So I remember having to talk to either police officers or soldiers, say and explain to them why I was driving on the road. So we got to recognize that the first time around when these checkpoints, when active duty soldiers were manning military police checkpoints on U.S. soil, and no one said anything about it, or very few people did, right? They were effective. They happened. No one shut them down. They just everybody just kind of agreed to it, right? Since that happened the first time, it's most likely going to happen again. And we're going to have these perpetually increasing levels of lockdown. So just keep that in mind, is that you're going to have transportation issues as we come forward into the next few years, honestly. So that's something to think about. And like I mentioned, another real solution for this, to the religious tyranny of, say, your governor or your mayor or something says no churches can have in-person, meetings whatsoever. Well, this is where we, come back to, like I mentioned at the beginning, we come back to the playbook of Chinese Christians. House churches, the concept of the house church, a secret church literally in someone's house or home, they have become extremely popular and quite effective in concealing underground religious activity. In fact, the Chinese government itself, even if they do find a house church, a lot of times, if it's just 10 to 15 people or so, they tend to just leave it alone or just kind of turn a blind eye, because they know that there are millions of these secret house churches all over mainland China. So even the Chinese government understands that they can't get them all. So by having a decentralized nature of things, having a covert church just in someone's house, right? It's very effective. So, that's what we're preparing to set up here in the future if things get much worse. Now, when it comes to that, you also have to remember that all aspects of the house church must be considered. You've got to consider things like, how are people getting in and out of, the church? Are they coming in through the front door, through the back door? Is there a secret entrance? Is there some kind of something that neighbors would notice? Would external surveillance betray the existence of the church in the first place? Stuff like that has to be considered quite significantly. And then another thing that must be considered for specifically house churches is the stuff within the church, right? So although most religions on earth don't really have a whole lot of gear, right? They don't have a whole lot of what government forces would most likely label as contraband, right? Things that betray what's going on in a particular area. So, for instance, if you walk into a house, somebody's residential area, and they've got stacks of chairs in the corner or stacks of prayer rugs in the corner, they've got whole bookshelves full of neatly arranged Bibles, religious artwork and things, and like child's crafts and things on the walls. Well, you know what? It going to look like a church, right? There are very few churches in the world, regardless of religion, right? Regardless of what religion it is, there are very few religious structures that you can walk into anywhere in the world and not know that it's a religious structure. So, casual observers would instantly notice, hey, there's some religious activity going on here, right? So you've got to consider that a lot of these things are going to have to be stored covertly. There's no bigger giveaway that a house church is going down than to see, like I mentioned, stacks of Bibles and chairs, right? So this is where we get into the sort of dual use nature of things. And if you don't know what the nature of a dual use is, it's something that can function in one way, but can also function in another way. For instance, if you had large groups of chairs in your living room or something, well, that's going to imply that there's a large gathering of people there. And there's really no way to camouflage that to make it look like it was something natural. Whereas if you have a bunch of, like children's art, on the wall, you could say that it's your own kid's art, right? So, you could do things like, instead of having a bunch of either songbooks or Bibles or religious texts or whatever, Qurans, instead of having them stacked up neatly on a bookshelf, spread them out throughout the house, right? Spread them out throughout multiple bookshelves so that it makes it look like you just happen to collect them instead of they're there for, people to come and use, right? Also things like, religious, sacraments and things like that. I, don't really know the terms for a lot of, religious implements and items, but if you have them in a specific area, you might want to, move them around a little bit to make it look like it's something that you would own as a homeowner and not something that's set up as for like a church purpose, right? And then also we have to remember that certain religions have very specific things that could give away the presence of either religious activity or large groups of people. So right now, as we're filming this in, like I said, mid-December 2020, there aren't any governmental agencies or politicians cracking down on religion specifically. They're not saying you can't practice your religion. What they're doing is saying it's a de facto ban, right? They're saying that you can't have groups of more than 6 people in your home. Well, that would preclude a church service, right? So that is something that it's not necessarily a straight up ban of religion. That's not what's happening. It's a de facto ban on a lot of religion. And we have to realize that a lot of different religions have different things that could betray them. So for instance, this is one that came out earlier this year, and when we thought of it when it happened in September, I believe it was September, we were thinking, that's a good way to surveil people. So for those of you that aren't of the Jewish faith, the holiday of Sukkot, or Sukkot, however you pronounce it, sorry, I'm probably butchering that. It's a Jewish holiday in which very specific things have to happen. So people of the Jewish faith have to build what's called a temporary structure called a sukkah. And these are very small structures. You can see what they look like here on the slide, and there's various different ways of doing it, but one of the very key parts of the religious ceremony or holiday, right, is that it has to be outside. So if you look at a sukkah, if you see a sukkah in someone's yard, you know that they're Jewish, right? You know that people who are, of the Jewish faith live there, meaning that that's a good way. If you're going around, you could just be driving around on the road and you could see, that they mark them down as being a religious, pious person, right? So that's something that would make it very easy for someone, a casual observer, to either persecute or surveil someone, right? Likewise, people of the Islamic faith also have Ramadan, and Ramadan has a lot of these kind of considerations. Things like fasting during the holy month of Ramadan during the day, meaning that people of the Islamic faith can't eat or drink anything during daylight hours. So from sunrise to sunset, they tend to be very weak. People tend to be very tired. It's meant to be a very, not a whole lot of work being done. And for those of you who are in the military and served overseas in a predominantly Muslim nation, you know that terror or insurgent groups take advantage of Ramadans, particularly in Afghanistan. Every single year, it's like clockwork. As soon as Ramadan begins, terror attacks spike because they know that the ANA, the Afghan National Army, or the ANP, Afghan National Police, or any sort of authority figure within Afghanistan, they're going to be practicing Ramadan. But the insurgents or the terrorists, the members of the Taliban, since they are on jihad, seeing as they're on jihad, they don't need to fast. They don't need to partake in the mandates of Ramadan. So you've got an insurgent group which is well-fed, rested, doesn't have to pray 5 times a day. They don't have to do all these religious things in Ramadan. And then you have another group over here, like the Afghan National Army. They're going to be, very tired, very weak. Afghanistan is a very hard country to live in. Just normally, I can't imagine how difficult it must be to not eat or drink anything during daylight hours. So you can imagine the forced disparity there. So that is something that could potentially be betraying as well. And also, when the sun sets, there are usually pretty good feasts. So if I was some sort of governmental agency that wanted to catalog and go down the streets and see who's partying after hours, I would definitely make note of these Ramadan parties, which tend to happen after sunset when you can finally break the fast. And it tends to be a more community affair. So that's something for the Islamic faith that not a whole lot of people know about. And then, of course, Christianity is it's kind of an easy one. Anything that if you have, a nativity scene in your yard as opposed to some other sort of holiday thing, people know that you're probably a little bit more religious than the average bear, right? So really, any religious holiday is subject to scrutiny and surveillance because regardless of what religion it is, usually the religious holidays of any particular religion involve people coming together, right? Like I said in the beginning, religion tends to be bringing people together. So, holiday decorations that are more religious based tend to pinpoint people from the outside surveillance if that's, something that's going on. And then another thing to consider is that if you have it like this particular house church in China from a few years ago, there are audiovisual requirements to running a church, right? You have to have projectors, audio systems, computers, other technical stuff to make things, go, right? You have to have, storage for different kinds of media, at least in Christianity, music tends to be a very, very common unifying thing. So if you've got if you've got a group of 50 people or so in a cramped apartment that are singing songs, well, your neighbors on all sides of you will probably hear that and report it. So, singing, religious music, other audible clues that there's a lot of people in one area, those are dead giveaways of religious activity. So it's kind of hard to get around, but it's something that you have to think about if you're going to want to set up one of these house churches. And then another thing is just concealment, right? So one thing that has been, this is not necessarily unique to religious considerations. This is just like what we've been doing for a long time, which is using these old school wartime tactics to help internal security. So like blackout curtains, perfect example of this. Like, if you use blackout curtains, no one knows if you are awake or if you're asleep. No one knows from the outside. They can't see the lights on inside your house. So that's something that would be helpful as well. So for instance, if you live in an area where everybody goes to bed around the same time and it's, either rural or it's like kind of I'm thinking of like a subdivision setup. If you live in something like that where there aren't, groups of 100 people, coming to a single house at 1 a.m, these kind of blackout curtains might be able to help because it allows you to sort of blend in with the rest of the neighborhood when it comes to the lights being on or off. Another thing that might be helpful, not necessarily just for religious activities, but things like birthdays and other events in which people get together, is the concept of a Faraday box or some sort of box for your cell phone, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a Faraday box. It could be just a normal box that you keep by the front door, but a good practice, I don't know if it would be easy to convince people to do. Even we here at the SU Underground have a hard time convincing people to do it. But it's something that you could do. So like those of us who work in the intelligence profession, they know that no phones of any kind are allowed in a secured area. And usually outside the door of that secured area, there's like a little phone booth. There's either little lockers or like a little table or something for you to put your phone, so that you put your phone, you come out of your office, every couple of hours, check your phone and go back in. That's how it works in the intel community. And this would be a great thing to implement for the civilian sector. You could even make it a fun holiday tradition where, you force people to leave their smartphones at the door so that you could, reconnect with friends and family without technology, without anybody scrolling or, Snapchatting or anything like that. But regardless, it's going to be a pretty hard sell to make. But the reason that we're talking about this is because mobile technology, particularly smartphones, or as we like to call them, spy satellites in your pocket. smartphones are definitely 100,000% being used to track people as part of this coronavirus stuff. So this whole contact tracing, right? We like to call it contact tracing in society because surveillance and intelligence collection sounds bad, but that's exactly what it is. It's tracking your exact location, so that whoever, either private company or governmental forces, can find you, right? So even though a lot of these contact tracing either apps or procedures are voluntary at the moment, a lot of times they're not, and by the time we figure out that they're not voluntary, it will be too late. So they're not going to tell us that it's involuntary until they start enforcing it. So this sort of thing is something that we have to think about, this sort of technical intelligence, this electronic intelligence that's going on. Even though it may be a hard sell to get, Aunt Sally to drop her cell phone off at the door, it's something that might be necessary as we move forward into the future and, years from now. Another thing that not a whole lot of people know about is the concept of MASINT, or Measurement and Signatures Intelligence. So MASINT is something that not a whole lot of people, even within the intelligence community, know either about, or they don't really know how to explain it, because it's not an image, it's not necessary, it's not really, something that's like, electronics, not SIGINT. So it's Measurement and Signatures Intelligence. And one of the things that we think of when it comes to this is ALPR systems, or Automated License Plate Reader systems. So for lack of a better term, or lack of an easier way of explaining this, there a lot of police cars, public cameras, security cameras, and public traffic lights a lot of times are set up with these ALPR systems. And what they do is they scan, it's a camera type system, and it scans your license plate. And what it does is it will tag your license plate with a geo-coordinate, meaning that, hey, camera number so-and-so saw this license plate heading this direction at this time. And then that is put into a database so that people can, so that law enforcement can allegedly use it to track stolen cars. It makes it easy so that, license plate number blank was stolen, 2 hours ago, put it out on the system. Oh, that license plate just popped up over here at this intersection. So let's go there and check it out. That's what it was invented for. But now we're starting to see these license plate readers be used to track people in their homes or in their own neighborhoods, right? So all it takes is a police car driving by your house to pick up your light, because these are 360-degree cameras a lot of times. A police car driving by your house with it turned on. The officer inside probably has no idea that it's even happening, or in a lot of cases it's just automated and no one knows, right? So that if their camera happens to see a license plate, it will flash up an alert for the officer, so they can say, oh dang, look, this car's stolen. So it's automatic a lot of times, but you don't want your license plate in a database, right? So a simple solution would be to just back into your driveway so the license plate isn't facing the road. That way it completely defeats the system. Now, I know a lot of states out there have license plates that go on the front of your vehicle as well. So I don't have a really good solution for that, other than just trying to park in such a way that if a car were driving by with a camera on it, could it see your license plate? So that's something that we've got to consider as we move forward. Now, of course, I'm not saying that this is happening. Oh my gosh, they're surveilling our neighborhoods right now. No, I'm not saying that. We don't even have any evidence of that happening. It's just limited anecdotal stuff that's not really solid intel. But we are saying that it's definitely going to happen in the future. So this technology exists now, the potential exists now, but as we move forward into a new age of, I hate to use buzzwords, but like COVID tyranny, right? This is something that is probably going to happen very soon. And then something else which is very interesting, this is another concept that is, we have to start realizing what is legal and what isn't legal, in terms of what is actually going to be done about it. So for instance, thermal imaging. So a lot of you probably have heard of the 2006 case of, or really it actually goes back to, I think, 2001, of police officers using thermal imaging they were just parked on the street, and they were using the thermal imaging to look at this guy's house to determine that he had like a marijuana grow going on, because the marijuana grow lights apparently get very, very hot. So the police looked through their thermal imaging system, saw that his house was hot, used that to get a search warrant, and they busted him for marijuana. Well, he filed a Fourth Amendment complaint, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, yep, law enforcement do not have the ability to, using thermal imaging to search a place from the street is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. You have to get a warrant first, and then you can use your thermal imaging. So that was back in 2006. But here's the deal. Just because the Supreme Court rules on something does not mean that something very, very similar is already being infringed upon by a lower court. So even though the Supreme Court ruled that thermal imaging is a blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment, we have things like stingray devices. Yeah, like I said, the Supreme Court ruled that the authorities scanning their home with an infrared camera without a warrant constituted an unreasonable search and seizure barred by the Fourth Amendment. So, moving forward to 2014 in Tacoma, Washington, one of the very interesting things that happened was that from 2009 to 2014. The county of Tacoma, their Superior Court judges unknowingly signed more than 170 orders that Tacoma police and other law enforcement agencies say authorize them to use a device that allows investigators to track a suspect's cell phone, but also sweep cell phone data from innocent people nearby. So here's the deal. You've got in 2001, or really 2006 when the Supreme Court ruled on it, 2006 the Supreme Court says you can't use thermal devices without a warrant because that is a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Fast forward to 2014, after that ruling, you've got Tacoma Police Department lying to judges and telling them that they're signing a warrant for this, but really it's for blanket surveillance and things like that. So yeah, these judges signed more than 170 orders for the Tacoma Police Department, but here's the kicker. They did not know that they were signing these orders, and also all 22 of these Superior Court judges first learned of the police department's cell phone site simulator, the Stingray. They only learned what they signed the warrant for because the news media caught on to it. So that's a huge thing as well. So we need to stop looking at things from like, oh, the Supreme Court said this, but, so you can't do that. Well, guess what? You change the situation slightly. Oh, it's not a thermal imaging device, it's an electronic surveillance device instead. Well, now that particular case has to go all the way to the Supreme Court as well. So, and it's unlikely to do so. So, that's what we wanted to mention, is that there are other systems out there. Just because the law says XYZ does not mean that our nation's law enforcement will follow XYZ. It means that, it provides the opportunity for doing good, but not necessarily providing the infrastructure for it. So that's what we wanted to mention as well. So, sort of wrapping up this very meandering and kind of random episode in which we try to speak very delicately about these sort of issues, we wanted to say that we need to start being proactive and not reactive. We need to start thinking ahead instead of trying to play catch up. And really, that's going to have to happen from each individual person. It's going to have to be each individual church. I do know that, here at the SG Underground Project, we may or may not be setting up, places for these churches, right? That might, start popping up. So we need to start thinking about this sort of thing. And I understand that the nature of religion itself is that a lot of people would really rather, not be around if they can't practice their religion. And, that's a person's choice. But what we're trying to do is walk that line between practicing your religion in the most practical way possible, and also being as safe as possible about it. So that's what we wanted to talk about today. I'm sorry that this is kind of, once again, like a very random sort of episode, but it's kind of a hard topic to talk about. It really is. It's very difficult to talk about a lot of this stuff. So yeah, that's all we've got for this episode. Remember to check out our other content. We have all kinds of stuff on YouTube. We've got videos on how to hide people in your home if it comes to that. We've got podcasts talking about it as well. We've got a quite successful mini series of many hours of content on how to avoid some of this electronic surveillance and how you can basically be a human being in 2020 or 2021 and not be surveilled as much as, say, somebody else. So make sure to check that out. If you like this YouTube channel and the YouTube content we have, check us out on our podcast, which we'll link below. Chances are, if you like our YouTube content, you'll also like our podcast. Even if you're not really a podcast person, we get that all the time. People saying, "Hey, I'm not really a podcast person, but I really enjoy the content you put on your podcast." So check that out if you want. If you also don't want to support YouTube, or if this YouTube video gets removed, we also upload all of our YouTube content to lbry.tv, which we will also link below. That is a decentralized system that can never be taken offline. So even if YouTube decides to ban us for whatever reason, we'll still be on lbry.tv. So with that, that's all we have for this time. Hopefully it was helpful. We're probably going to put out more content on this in the future, but until then, we will see you next time. So always remember to fight in the shade. S2Actual out.